Meeting to order. We respectfully acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. The first item is the adoption of the agenda, and there's a request by staff to change the order of 6. And Mr. Woolsey would like to go first, and so he is going to be A, and Denise will be B, and so Soji will be C. Is there a move for the agenda as amended? Trustee Schmidt, all those in favor? Opposed, motion carries. You have the minutes of November 28th before you. Is there a mover for the adoption of those minutes? Trustee Smith, Trustee Drummond. Any discussion? All those in favor? Opposed, motion carries. Action list. It's not because we're action list, it's just that it's all being done. And no petitions and delegations, and Mr. Foley.
So maybe if I may introduce.
Yes, please.
The board has asked a pre-budget, before they really dig into the budget, to have 4 conversations. One around the technology end of the business here, Aboriginal education, skills and dual credit, and learner support. And so we have scheduled 2, we're hoping for 30-minute presentations, and that will be optimistic. However, that's what we're sort of aiming for today, and again, if there's more and deeper questions, then happy to do more of these. But we wanted to make sure you had a clear understanding of what's happening, in this case, in technology in our district right now. So that's
Are these TV screens new, continuing, or are they just for the show?
They have been here since Christmas.
I guess it just sort of.
It was a seamless transition.
It's a seamless transition. The content is new. So I'll turn this over to Mr. Posey, who has brought some guests with him to help us all understand what's happening in the wonderful world of tech.
There we go. We're ready to go. So thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you about technology and all the wonderful things that are happening in the district. So today I'd like to talk about where we've been traveling for the last 5 years. We've been working through a tech plan that's been sort of growing and changing and morphing. I want to talk to you about what you'll experience in our schools, how we're supporting our teachers, and then give you some time with our crew from a call called Hill, who have been doing some block-based coding in the Sphero robots. And they're going to actually take you through a little bit of coding activity. So that's what we've got in store for you. So first of all, just to talk a little bit about the road we've been traveling. Over the last 5 years, we've had a tech plan in place. We framed that whole tech plan around something called SAMR. And it was a way for our teachers to think about technology. And down at the S, the substitution area, we want our teachers to feel okay that you're just substituting. You are doing word processing rather than doing pen and pencil, but you're starting to move and incorporate technology. But the ultimate goal as we move through the plan is to move our practice to this R area, the redefinition, where we reimagine what we can be doing in our classroom, in our learning through inquiry and through challenge-based learning, and we leverage the technology to do tasks that we didn't think were possible before. Asking experts to respond to questions through Twitter, publishing your learning to a global audience, blogging with a class, whether it's down the hall or it's around the world. So that was the frame of what our plan was all about. And within that structure, we had 3 sort of pillars with goals. The first being infrastructure, where we were focused on bandwidth and cloud services and hardware and software standards. And then staff development, how do we support our staff, provide mentorship and collaboration opportunities. And then the classroom structures of how do we incorporate UDL principles, flexible and personalized learning opportunities. That was all built into our thinking of the plan. So to start with, this graphic is built this way intentionally. We have to focus somewhat on infrastructure in order to provide learner support. And if we don't have solid infrastructure, over quite easily. So, sorry about that, Grant. So as far as our tech plan goes, we focused on bandwidth. Did we have enough connectivity in our buildings? If we needed a fire hose and we only had a garden hose and we couldn't get out to the web, we were in trouble. Did we have solid networks? Were we keeping threats out of our building? Our public-facing servers, such as our mail and our web server, are under daily attack. So the tech team is always mitigating attacks, and it doesn't matter what organization you're in. If you have a public-facing server, you are being attacked all the time by bots and things. Wireless networks were a huge one for us. At the board office, we wanted to unify our directory. So rather than having 5 services with 5 individual logins, we wanted to start moving to a single username and password. We're almost there. Servers in schools, we wanted to make sure they were privacy compliant, and yet they were cloud-based and accessible from home. We renewed our copier fleet, and we included print management. And the print management was a real important step for us. It resulted in some significant savings for our schools over the last year. We moved to a library system that rather than having a server in every building, we have a central cloud-based where we can access digital resources. And we've expanded our web server and mail server and help desk services. So all of those things are down in this bottom piece and are important so that we can really focus on what we want, which is our classroom learning. I'll highlight wireless infrastructure because it's like a utility now. You walk into a building, you expect to have Wi-Fi almost instantly, just like the light switch. So we had designed 5 years ago our networks at high schools to support about 2,000 devices simultaneously, and our elementary is about 1,000. Going forward, we're in March, we're going to start hardening our networks so that we actually can support up to 3,000 devices in our secondaries and about 1,500 in elementary. And that's because it's the Internet of Things. Kids are walking in with watches, phones, laptops, everything you name it, light bulbs. They are taking up address space on our network. So it's growing, and we are addressing it. On the learning side, which is the big part of that pyramid, we've been moving from event-based to an embedded model. So we tried to change our classroom structures and reorganize. So traditionally, every Tuesday afternoon or every Friday, you might do all of it type, or you might go and do Math Blast, or you walk to the lab. It was an event you went to. And quite often, I'm glad I've done my technology now. And over the last 5 years, we've moved this to embedding it into our classrooms. So it's portable, it's nimble, and it can happen anywhere. It doesn't have to be in the box of the classroom. It can be outside. It can be wherever we can get that connectivity. And the metaphor we used was David and Goliath, and it was that transition from the old traditional to using lightweight, nimble tools that would be more effective for our learners. So in our schools, what do you experience? Well, right now we've got 2,400 tablet devices. We've got 1,000 desktops or laptops. You've got smart boards. We have core apps for right K to 12, and as I've said, it's embedded. We've got display technology. It's either projectors or we are moving to this as our standard. So projectors are going away, and we have this type of projection technology. We have lots of access to centralized robotics and maker resources, and it's all focused around rich media tools. So when I talk about rich media tools, these are some of our core apps, not all. And this is the sort of smorgasbord that our teachers and our students have access to. So we've got iMovie for video production. We've got Explain Everything, which is a bit of a Swiss Army knife where you can assemble audio, video, sound. You can record your screens and share them. Very powerful tool. You've got Book Creator, where you can do EPUB books and you can share them digitally across devices. Just to point out a couple others, we've got animation. We've got both frame animation and stop motion animation. So if you remember how we created, or how George Lucas created Star Wars back in the day, that was stop motion. We've got our productivity suite. We've got Pages for desktop publishing. We've got Keynote for presentations. We've We've got Word, Excel, PowerPoint, all the core standard Microsoft apps available to our students. We've got OneNote. And now we've got OneDrive, which is a Canadian cloud storage area where each user gets a terabyte of data storage, and it's in our Canadian cloud. And parallel to that, for the last 4 years, we've had our own cloud, or Nextcloud, and that is an on-premise cloud storage that can be accessed from home and in school. And then on the lower right, we have our EdInform app, which is our built by our teachers for our teachers, developed around communicating student learning and e-portfolios. So that's the core apps that you see in our buildings. And then down below the strip, just highlight a few of our computational thinking and coding apps. We've got Swift Playgrounds, which allows our students to actually work with true Swift coding language, which is how the apps are coded on your iPhones or your iPads. And they get an introduction and they work in a 3D world. So their code that they design gives them immediate feedback from this avatar that they actually move around to solve challenges with. We've got a Microbit app, and I'll talk about Microbit shortly, but that is actually a little chip right here. And we have kits of these Microbits available that go out to our schools. And the students can do a whole bunch of block-based coding, which means there's code already built, but they learn how to manipulate the blocks, think logically, build algorithms, and actually work with these devices. We also have the Sphero EDU, and we have these Sphero robots, which are going to get introduced a little bit later. Fantastic little robot devices. And then we've got Lightbot Hour, which would be for our primary kids, where they're introduced to block-based coding and logic, and how do they actually start working with code. So that's what our students will see right K through 12 as a core app set. I'm just going to throw up a couple examples.
Glenn, is this a 5-year plan? Are we in year 5?
We are at the end. As of this coming January, we will need to have activated a new plan.
And is the investment and the progress being consistent over those 5 years, or have you seen an uptake in the last 2 years? Or like if you told us this story 2 years ago, would it be 40%, 60% complete?
It would have been about 50 or 60%. We've done fairly well in sticking to that plan and rolling it out over the 5 years. Certainly we've had some budget considerations and things like that would have slowed us up, like particularly on things such as wireless and other big commitments. But overall, it's gone fairly close to schedule, and it's been a growing, changing plan. So we've sat down with DTAC every year and adjusted and tweaked what our District Tech Advisory Committee, made up of teachers, principals, and senior staff members. So just a couple examples. Here's an example of Explain Everything, and I'm not going to show it all.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and this is my conflict mind map. It can take a while to comprehend, and I know that it's a bit busy for most people's taste, but it portrays my understanding and knowledge of the concept conflict. My map is kind of like a web or cluster of ideas, and starting in the middle with the main concept, the conflict, and going out to set small ideas, area, responsibility, recognition.
So she will continue to explain her whole concept map, her understanding. She's recorded this as a screencast. She was able to share this with other students. She was able to hand it in to the teacher this way. And she goes along also to do the self-evaluation, where she actually marks up the scoring rubric. And so this is just one snippet of what you can use Explain Everything for. Video production, we have iMovie. Here's a student who created a trailer to promote his upcoming presentation about space and gravity and the impacts on the human body. So lots of different access points for our students, and I'm just going to show a couple examples here of block-based coding. And because I'm showing you the end result, it's hard to show all the learning and all the coding that's taken place. But here's a student out at Francis Kelsey that's been using prediction and rate and time and distance to try and get this robot to navigate through this course. So when you look at this, they're doing the same type of work that our developers that are doing robotic vacuums or self-driving cars are starting to learn all of those types of analytic and algorithmic thinking skills. And we had one here where the student ripped it right around. Looks easy. A whole bunch of code went into sorting that out. So our kids are doing things such as makey. Here's a little video joystick. Here's a student that took a traditional Pac-Man game and has recoded it. This is in Jeff Hutzer's program at Cowichan Secondary. Here's Arduino, they're called, and I'll speak about those a little bit more, where they're turning on and off light sensors and learning basic electronics. In this particular example, 3D World, the student built a continent and then put a whole bunch of TNT in it and blew it up, and the computer actually calculated how big the crater was, and he's doing some calculations on what was happening in his virtual demo. Here's 3D printing. They did this one with paper, but they can also, this is where they actually make boxes and packages, and they do it through 3D printing, or they do it with paper and folding. Brilliant example, this is now glass cutting. This is plexiglass, and they have a machine, they make their code, they design their graphic, the etcher etches it, they frame this in wood and put LED lights behind it. So these are the types of opportunities that our kids are seeing across the schools. Here's a 3D, just like this EDU breakout box where we put a lock on and you get physical clues and you try to break in or break out of this box. Here a student has made a 3D room, and with clues, his peers are challenged to break out of his virtual room.
Are you archiving some of this wonderful code that they're writing?
It's their code. They can take it with it. I'm certain some of the code the teachers are keeping. I tend to just grab samples. So moving on from there, what else you'll see in our schools? We have moved to Office 365 as our standard productivity suite in the cloud. Right now, all staff have access. We are starting to implement this for our 8 to 12s, and we'll be looking at our grade 4 to 7 once that implementation is done. So we intentionally delayed moving to a cloud productivity platform, and that's because we were waiting for there to be a privacy compliant, a BC law privacy compliant option. You'll know lots of our neighbors around us. There's G Suite up and down the island and in the lower mainland, but there's a core group of us as school districts that put the brakes on and have been waiting. And I'll talk to that in just a few minutes. The beautiful part of this is they are industry standard apps that everybody recognizes, and you have real-time collaboration. So anywhere, anytime, you can have 2 or 3 people collaborating on the same document, and it all works just beautifully. So why Office? This is the ugly slide that I have here. This is our privacy law. It basically says that as a public body, we are required to store all personally identifiable information in Canada. That's the line in the legislation. Now the way around that is to get informed consent. So you can have people sign off their rights, and the moral question on that is, should we be expecting that our parents sign off and that we're putting their data under another country's jurisdiction as far as privacy? So we've chosen to go in the O365 direction, and this is where it gets really, even if we go after informed consent, because we don't lock all our systems out. We do this and get informed consent. But this is where it gets, this highlighted section here. So for example, if a public body wanted to consent to store a student's email about their parents' divorce on a server located outside of Canada, the public body would have to obtain the consent of both the student and of each of her parents. And if the student's next email contained the personal information of the friends she made during spring break, the public body would have to get that consent too. So as we start doing schoolwork, and if we say this is an expectation that you'll use this system, this is a rabbit hole we've decided not to head down. So big driver for us right now is in the redesigned curriculum is the ADST, and we're focusing on design thinking, making, and coding in a big way. Lisa is traveling around a whole bunch in our school district and actually getting taps on the shoulder around the province to work on design thinking, this whole empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test, this whole iterative cycle that we're asking our kids to develop thinking skills around. We do a whole bunch of unplugged activities. This picture up here is a group of students working on a mapping activity where they're learning to do block-based coding based on different commands and obstacles that they're moving around. We also have unplugged such as Codapillar. So looks like a kid's preschool toy. Lisa's been using this right up to grade 7, grade 8. They're doing all sorts of things around prediction. These are all instruction blocks. It pulls apart, you can reorganize and recode, and it gets the students starting to work through challenges and do that computational thinking. So they deconstruct the problem, they look for patterns, they sort of throw out what they don't need, and then algorithmically they start writing what are the steps to solve the challenge. Same thing with Cubeto. We have one of these in each school. Many of our schools have 2 or 3 now. So this is a block-based coding as well with a board. You actually put your commands on the board. And each of these patterns have different challenges. You can tell a narrative, you can write a story around the travels of Cubeto. There's all sorts of ways to integrate this into our curriculum in a cross-curricular way. It works, integrate math challenges, all sorts of different things. Lisa's done a wonderful customizable mat where she's done some of our Hulkaminam and First Nation symbols, and anything you want to say about that while I'm talking? You're just smiling away. And then Sphero. I mentioned this Sphero looks just like a round ball, but this Sphero introduces you to block-based coding, but it's being used as part of a simple machine in Maker projects. It's being used in Maker and design thinking ways such as, let's empathize with a chariot driver or a farmer. Let's design the best plow possible. Let's use this as the oxen for our plow, and let's code this then to plow the field or to follow the racetrack of the chariot. All sorts of things that this is being integrated into, and you'll get an introduction to this later. One of our latest additions is this microbit. So this microbit is a little circuit chip. Right now you see it's showing the number 1 on it. This was a Fitbit that we designed, so there's my, out of duct tape, there's my wrist strap. and then this sat up on my wrist. And with the block-based coding that was done, there's an accelerometer in here. When I shake this, you'll notice it goes to 2 and 3. So there's my step counter. So our kids can get introduced to how does this technology work? How do I code it? How do I build it? And so we have a number of kits that are available that can go out to the schools and be worked with. And again, it's block-based coding, which you'll get a bit of an introduction to. We can also put alligator clips on here for moisture sensors, for heat sensors, all sorts of things. It's a Bluetooth. You can put a Wi-Fi antenna on it. There's lots of things in that one little chip that our students can integrate across the curriculum.
That got the kids' attention.
Whoa, Wi-Fi! And again, Swift Playgrounds, that now becomes sort of our flagship introduction to coding. It is when we move out of block-based and into actually a language. The Swift Playgrounds gives us that sort of grade 5 to 10 or 5 to 12, and it's available across all of our devices. So how do we support our teachers in doing all this? So in the plan, we had laid out mentor-teacher opportunities where they were acting as peer coaches. We've got 17 this year signed up. We asked or challenged them to focus on challenge-based learning, inquiry, and connecting our students to real-world challenges and problems. We have a fantastic curriculum learning team of specialists that get out and work around all of those inquiry-type challenges. We have been facilitating the Vancouver Island Learning Network, the ADST in coding. We've had 140 participants at the last one with 11 districts represented, which is very exciting, and approximately 45 attendees from our district at that event. We've got a technology services call desk that we try to be as responsive as possible when challenges arise. And we're really close, fingers crossed, of getting close to a dual credit coding course. And on top of that, embedding an adult option where our teachers can come in at little cost or no cost and learn side by side with their kids. So we're in conversation with VIU right now. And then we step back, and on top of all those other things, we're doing all of these on a day-to-day basis out of tech, which is supporting our financial systems and our KEV accounting, transportation, heating. These are all servers or systems with extracts or support as needed. Of course, MyEd is our full student information system. SSDAS, which is another information system. We use cell phones, and then all of our privacy procedures. How do we make sure we know where our data is, we have control of our data, and we are keeping what needs to be private. So that's enough from me. Before we do questions. Oh, you want me to just point? Yes, thank you, Rod. Just as a note, I've put together a technology fact sheet that I thought would be helpful. It just walks through how the department is structured, how many people we have sort of responsible for what, the number of computing devices, the ratio of our technicians to devices, which is 1 to about 600 devices, where we're heading with wireless networks, Office 365, also the ratio of our students to computers, which right now is approximately 1 device per 3 students. So not a bad gap for when we look at equity and access. And then on the back, I just polled some of our teachers. They flipped me some emails, and I just quickly, this is literally a cut and paste of, hey, here's what's happening and what we're seeing in our schools. A little bit of an elementary perspective and a little bit of a secondary perspective.
That's code.
It's code.
absolutely.
Okay, so thank you. We've got a group from Nicole Cobble Hill. They will find a trustee or a pair of trustees if you'd like to do this in pairs. And they are going to do 2 things. They are going to, first of all, show you how to code just drawing with their finger. And they're going to show you what the JavaScript code that's generated looks like. And then they're going to actually do some block-based coding. And if they can grab a pylon or a cone, and they're going to actually show you, let's make this robot do a simple shape. And you'll get to experience what block-based coding looks like and how it works.
So they might be a little shy,
Okay?
so I have to spread
The
Sure.
trustees or the,
Come on over.
Yeah, we're covered now.
Almost for this in French as well.
Oh,
So,
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
in-
we'll
in
read through
French.
this all in French too. So, Mr. Doman, we'll get Jeevan to go with you if you'd like. And Mr. Groot, we can get the girls can go with you. And how about, I don't know, Elizabeth, yeah, why don't you go with Zoe and Yura?
You can do this and find a corner wherever
Yeah,
you want.
And then maybe we can get Jeevan to work with both of you and if you want to join. And here's your, yeah, okay. Yeah, and William is back now. Okay, this is great. William, so what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is good. William, yeah. Where we,
I was over there.
Yeah.
So I can.
that sounds good. Do you girls want to go already? Is that where?
Right
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm starting to like, okay, hold on. This thing just turned on. So buddy, you gotta remember, we don't know anything you're talking about. You know what I'm gonna do? There. It's better, are they actually better with the face? Oh, you're, oh, it's together than I am. No, I'm not. Maybe you're show me. Oh, I'm ready. Yes. Very cool. So,
Overall, code
you have the opportunity to hear something. To like different stuff. You find it easy. It's the cutest thing ever. I know. Oh, I know. Well, you know. I'll tell you a bunch of stories. I mean, you know, one refugees and was in class. Yeah, so he's sitting here and Kibetta's, you know, racing towards him as you say, right? And he's like, it's funny, right? And so the person was like, correct, that's how it's like, this. There's a robot. And they're all
So I did the demo in French, the French book.
Yeah.
So you show it.
Yeah, I was wondering, I was like, you said Valentine's Day, that's not.
Here's your bag.
And that's where the speed rats, like I'm gonna do a presentation in April, and I'm gonna tell a story. Yeah, and I was like, I haven't quite worked it out, but it'll allow me to tell the story as he travels to different places in my story. It'll give me time to be able to say that on the fly, right? So that's what I'm doing.
And then you show the code, so you draw on the shape. So then we can show how you're actually start coding the watch.
So you wanna put it into one will you spend
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, coding. Coding. Either way.
So that's the drawing you did, right?
These are grade 6. Okay, show us how first position.
It's totally cool. Like I said, sorry, but it's French me. But I'm totally. I think that in Comas that does the robot wars from child to Vancouver, and he moved through that school district. And he brought up his robot and showed me. I'm like, you get to see it all the time. So to watch him do what he does, and I'm thinking, wow. Well, gratitude.
I can make it.
Bigger size.
How much more time do you need?
You know what, we can probably bring it back and then go to questions. Let's say, so all answers.
Check with Rob.
Keeps also build this. When will Seattle to do all this cool stuff? Why
This
don't
is-
trustees get to do this?
This is Spiro EV, part of Spiro, just a live robot. And every one of those devices, it's just terrible access.
Why haven't we, I mean, we're all competitive, why have we ever tried to do it? You can't like boss.
We need to come forward and have some more time with Lisa and I.
I think we'll get to team building at some
So bring it, I want 2 more. You want 2 more minutes, okay. So you got a 2-minute warning. And no, you shouldn't talk to people. Okay, trustees, you need to stop playing.
Thank you. Stop learning.
Stop learning. No, that's not learning. Stop playing. And there's
We were just learning about colors here.
pizza and everything right in the lunchroom. You got just right there, and probably the iPad just close to the lunchroom.
Because it's. We were just learning about colors.
Arslan, oh, you're gonna keep it.
We didn't get over.
Sure. Do you want them to say who they were? Okay. Yeah. So just wait right here, you guys. We're just gonna say goodbye.
Okay, they were a lot of fun. Can they come back and play with us again?
Yeah.
We got to play with
To the staff and
some of us
students of Cobble Hill, thank you so much for
Stand right in.
sharing your learning.
Thank you so much for being part of my presentation. That was absolutely wonderful. So Lisa, I'll let you-
So this is Zoe, she's in grade 6 in Grant's class, Mirva is in grade 6 in Grant's class, Caleb is in grade 7 in Grant's class, Jeevan is in grade 7 in Grant's class, and William is in grade 7. So, at 6, right? And I was like 7, 6. And then Lisa's been overworking with Grant, which has been really, really great. So when you reach out, our district technology crew are amazing. They really come out, and so the kids learned with Lisa and Grant, who paired together for all of this. So we're really grateful. for all
And
the
Lisa,
support.
while you have the stage, what happened yesterday in your school? Just in.
Oh, so yesterday
2 minutes
we
or
had the
less.
gravity car challenge, and it was so exciting. It was one of those hilarious days where we had kindergarten registration going on, wrestling going on, gravity car challenge going on in the afternoon, and the kids just had a blast. It was so noisy and fun, and lots of little kids came out and were able to watch the races as well. So we got as many kids in the school involved in watching and learning as well. So it was really, really fun. So thank you. For
Thank you.
providing our kids with those
Thanks, guys.
opportunities.
Very good.
And just as we move to questions, so then you would move from a Sphero to something like a Lego Mindstorms robot, again, more complex, different coding, and right up to a Vex robot, which then you can actually have them mechanically, get mechanical arms and all sorts of things. So there's a layered approach here that we're trying to embed.
But are you trying to get it to the point where they can build their own robots?
I mean, in a perfect world, you mean when you say their own, like rather than a kit like this, like that we can do all sorts of things with this kit.
Yeah.
And they can create, different shapes, different functions. There's different motors where they could make a digger out of this. Or are you actually thinking of a real world challenge where we want them to solve a much bigger problem?
No, see, when you put that down, I just assumed it was like that. I
No,
didn't-
so there's arms, there's motors, there's levers, and you can expand. This is a Lego, so lots of different components that would go to this. So this starts to becoming more and more powerful. And so the answer to that, yes, we always want to challenge them to move further and further. And then certainly in our 10 to 12 space, they're doing Vex robotics. Those kids that are interested, it's offered. And that's much more mechanical arms and all sorts of bigger scale, bigger motors.
And the suite of apps that you showed prior to the 365 cloud apps, are they available on all those 3,000 some odd tablets?
All 2,400 devices. Yeah, we budget $30 a device, and those are rolled out as a standard app set.
So they come loaded to the school. When they get to the school,
Yes.
they're preloaded with all those apps.
And with our management software, when I hand a device off, within about 10 minutes, it's contacted our app store server, which is on a management system, and it loads to the device, and you're ready to go. So we've automated that onboarding process. And when you compare that to, if we back up 5 years when we still had computer labs, I was spending $30 to $50 per app, and sometimes putting 10 apps in a lab. And so when you look at the value proposition, this is an excellent value. And as we swap these devices out, as we're doing now, we're just upgrading 1,200 of these because they've aged out. All those apps get pulled off, and they're going right back on, which is about a $45,000 savings because we're reutilizing all those licenses.
So what did we do before you started your 5-year plan?
So in the previous
Was there a previous 5-year plan?
Yeah, so in our previous plan, we standardized we changed all of our servers over. We sort of did, the previous plan was what I call the WestJet model. We standardized across the board. We wanted to be able to fix something once and fix it everywhere if we ran into a problem. And that was then. That was computer labs. That was let's standardize. This is what we run. And now we're moving to what I would call the messy classroom, because technology is moving so quickly. this year it's this device, next year it's something of a different shape. And in order for us to keep enabling our learning environments to keep up, we're in this cycle of change, and it's not going to be this nice cookie cutter, the same all the time. We'll do it as much as we can because that's good management of systems, but we need that variability and that flexibility.
Thank you. Trustees, any other questions? Then thank you so much
Well,
for
thank you
sharing
for
your
that.
incredible story with us.
Yeah, and I just want to thank Glenn and the kids. I think you could have picked 6 kids out of any of our elementary schools, and you would have got the same kind of conversation from those kids. Certainly as you're around and about, and I would encourage you to go around and about. And so what you saw here was, 10 minutes sort of thing, but if you see events that are happening in schools that come out in the mid-month, or we talk about in the updates, go hang out while the kids are working on some of this stuff. It's quite amazing when you see large groups of kids doing this work. And I think what Glenn's underselling a little bit is the leadership that this district is now, has it all along, but is now really being recognized for providing both on the island provincially, the ADST model, the Vancouver Island Learning Network that Glenn's built around ADST and coding. So when Jan Unwin from the ministry was up here yesterday, and she was up you met with her in Vancouver a couple of weeks ago, ministry's interested in that model spilling out across the province, is using the model that Glenn and Lisa have put together. So it's interesting. If you ask a bunch of kids about technology, they're going to be somewhat stumped sometimes to tell you, because it's not technology like I'm going to go to class. It's just stuff they have and use, which they wouldn't tell you about a pen either. Do you have, tell me about using your pen, huh? Right? And so it's sort of that embedded nature of it, and supplying the on-demand needs of teachers, as well as teachers are ready to go to the next step. How do you provide that on-demand instruction for them to help them be confident to go to the next step, and trust the kids, and trust that pressing the wrong button is not going to blow anything up or any of that stuff. So it's a pretty cool model and some pretty brilliant work. So thanks, Glenn.
Okay, our second item under education is Aboriginal education with Denise.
There's Denise. Fell out of her chair there for a second.
No, you're good. No, you don't need to put it at all.
Denise, fresh back from being up in Prince George on Sunday and Monday, working and contributing to their big Aboriginal day that they had across their district, and sharing some of the work that's happening here, and helping them think through some of their challenges.
Do y'all have one of these? Anybody want one that doesn't have one? First, yes.
So while Denise is handing those out, same thing for Denise has done the same thing that Glenn has done, which is we could present you with a whole bunch of facts and figures, and if those aren't linked to sort of some images and some stories, they sort of disappear out of your head. So you've got a bunch of facts and figures here that you can refer to, and then I'm sure Denise will touch on some of these. But it's also the images and the stories that you have in your head about the power and of this. All of our programs, Aboriginal here that we're going to talk about now, but so that we don't lose track of some of the facts, figures, and data about what's going on. I'll stop talking now, Denise.
Thank you for the moment. I appreciate it. I just want to start off. I guess I'm hoping a couple things. Each year I've done a presentation with this kind of information and sort of highlighted some things that are going on in the district. And this year I thought perhaps we could have more of a conversation. And so I'm going to start off with a little bit of a metaphor, I think it is.
for why we have an Aboriginal Education Department, and then highlight a couple of big ideas, and then I would invite you to engage in some questions if you have some questions. I was thinking recently, how do we talk about what we're doing in Aboriginal education and why it's important for everybody? And one of the ways that I'm trying to tell this story is, imagine that we've been on a 150-year or 200-year journey, and we have our Indigenous folks and our non-Indigenous folks traveling along beside each other. And then when they start out on this journey, they each have a really amazing and beautiful way to raise their children and help them grow into productive, healthy, happy adults. But as the journey goes along, the Indigenous people start to lose some of their ability to do that for their families. And so I'm imagining two hikers on a big long journey, and they're both all decked out in their gear, and as the journey goes along, you know, the Indigenous hiker starts losing things out of their backpack. They don't have their food rations anymore. They don't have their hunting supplies anymore. Their shoes are taken away. Their footwear is taken away. And as that journey goes on, we see the gap increase. And so our Indigenous folks start out so much farther behind our non-Indigenous folks. And so I was talking to a group of teachers recently, and we were talking, they were the ones that said, but the kids don't start off in the same place. When kids come to us, and I think Robbie talked about this a couple weeks ago, when our kids arrive, lots of our Indigenous kids aren't at the same place as our non-Indigenous kids. And obviously we're talking generalizations. So we start off with this huge gap. In recognition of that gap, the Ministry of Education has said we need to do some things to give our kids a leg up and start to help decrease that gap. If we just give them back their backpack and their shoes and their food supplies, it doesn't do anything to decrease that gap. We need to be doing things that are extra. And so that's how I'm starting to try to explain why we have a 131 budget. Because often I'm asked the question, they're kids like every other kid, why don't they just get treated the same as every other kid? How come we're doing things differently or special for them? So, so if you'll just indulge me a little bit, that's sort of where I'm starting from. In 2008, when I came into Aboriginal education, it was still a pull-out model. So the idea of enhancement was we go into the classroom, take our First Nations kids out, and do some cool stuff with them. I remember watching them do make dream catchers, and often these programs were provided by First Nations individuals, but often they weren't. They were non-Indigenous people offering this enhanced service. Then over the next few years, we shifted the model to include everybody, and there was a really purposeful reason for that. We needed the whole system to understand why Aboriginal education is important for everybody, and to create an inclusive environment. And when Glenn started talking about SAMR in the beginning, you know, we start off by doing a little bit of, what's the first one? Substitution, to really integrating, or, you know, Debbie and the rest of us will talk about inclusion, so integration versus inclusion. We're trying to create an environment where our Indigenous folks feel a sense of belonging, where they're accepted and understood by everybody in the organization. And so our work really changed from being pull out to, you know what, we need to get into the classrooms, we need to help teachers and the adults in the system understand what does it mean to be Indigenous and why is that important. In 2008, hardly anyone knew what Hul'qumi'num was. I know you've heard me say this before, right? And most people, when I ask them questions about Métis, if they read it, they would ask me, what is Métis? And so that's how far we've come. Now we have a program in all of our kindergarten through grade 7 schools where every single kid is learning some Hul'qumi'num. They already know, I would say, at least 15 words and probably more. And so I know that other districts have said, it gets in the news, right? So it gets in the news that all of their elementary kids are learning their Indigenous language. We've already been doing that. I'm just not so good at making a big deal about things because it's just the right thing to do. But I also think that's something for us to be really proud of. I also asked, Kara is the head of, She's our lead for that program. We've called it Every Learner Every Year. And we have an itinerant staff that go into every elementary school, and they're teaching our learners, all of our learners, about what it means to be Indigenous from this area. And I asked her can you just type out a list for me of all the stories that are taught in the last 4 years in our elementary classrooms. And all the ones that are highlighted are local Cowichan or Chemain, as like stories from our local nations. So these are stories that kids know well. It's not a story that they just hear once and they walk away. They play with that story, they work that story. And I think that's also something for us to be proud of. And it's something that I know that the ministry is being challenged with, because how do you create Indigenous resources when we have so many Indigenous languages in BC and so many unique nations? You can't just pump out a textbook and hand it out to everybody. It has to be really based on this place that we live in. And so I think I invite you to brag about this. This is a good thing. This is a great thing that we're doing here in Cowichan Valley. More recently, with the transformed curriculum, we've seen a really interesting and I think hopeful opportunity, because in the beginning, when the Aboriginal Education Department had the responsibility of moving the whole system. Now we have the ministry saying, you know what? That's not just the ABED's responsibility, that's all of our responsibility to build our knowledge and to integrate Indigenous worldview and content into our curriculum. That's a big message to come from the ministry, and it gives us permission to hold ourselves accountable to doing that work. And it's big work. It also gives us an opportunity to say, you know what, those targeted dollars, now we can really zoom in and think about how are we using those to give those kids a leg up. So the first, in the beginning, we had to use it to educate the system because our kids didn't have a chance otherwise. But now as the ministry saying, come on people, we all need to step on board, now we can target those dollars differently. There's some challenges though. So with the increase in all the divisions that we've had this year, targeted dollars haven't increased. And so I have the same number of staff visiting many more classrooms. And next year, if we add more divisions, which I anticipate we will, I won't have the staff to do it. So that program where all of our elementary kids are learning all this isn't sustainable. So I'm not sure, I'm struggling with that. We have to take it from somewhere to make that happen. So I think that's something I would invite you to talk about and to also struggle with me a bit about what do we want, what are our hopes and goals. I also want to remind you about some of the innovation that we've been supporting, because part of this conversation is doing things differently. So integrating Indigenous pedagogy, if we start with substitution, then I take a book and I read it to my class, you know, and we do some normal or regular literacy activities around it. But if I'm using Indigenous pedagogy, then I'm structuring the way I'm learning differently. And I'm doing things like, one of the things we know is really important for Indigenous learners is relationship. And if you talk to anybody who works in a school where there's lots of First Nations kids, they'll talk about how long it takes to trust, to build trust. I've been accused of that too, actually. And so if we know that it takes a long time, and relationship is the biggest indicator of what will help kids learn the best, then we have to pull some questions for ourselves. How can we continue to put 120 kids in front of a secondary school teacher every semester? If we know that being outside reduces anxiety, helps self-regulation, opens up the opportunities for learning, then how can we continue to keep kids in classrooms for 5.5 hours a day, every day? I don't know how we keep doing that. So, and there's lots of teachers asking that question, which is part of what spurred our land-based program. And land-based program is a good example of integrated, embedded, Indigenous pedagogy. if you walked in and it isn't sitting in a circle and passing a feather around. It's more subtle than that. It's about being outside, making sure everyone has a voice, making sure that if you don't feel comfortable, you have someone that can talk on your behalf, which is what we'll see in Indigenous communities all the time. So for me, that is another place where the system of a whole overlaps with the ABED department, giving our kids a leg up, and we need to again struggle with that. How is that sustainable, and is that who bears the responsibility of that kind of work? I think the last thing that I just want to touch on, and then I hope that you'll have some questions for me or for each other, is the idea of reminding ourselves to step into the canoe. And so I think you've heard me talk before about teachers ask me, okay, what are the first steps? Or everybody likes a 4-step or a 10-step solution, right? So my 4-step solution is this. If we want to begin our journey into embracing Indigenous pedagogy and worldview, number one is we need to know who we are. I need to know who I am and where I come from and what my influences are. I am an Indigenous woman with mixed ancestry, and so I have this unique place. It's actually not more common, actually, commonplace for maybe many of us, of having Indigenous ancestry, and I identify as Indigenous, but I also have Métis ancestry and English ancestry and French ancestry. One of my great-grandfathers was Portuguese Joe, one of the founders of Gastown and Vancouver, and really important person in changing the fishing industry. And he worked hand in hand and side by side with the Indigenous people. That's an important lens that I bring to the work I do, and I invite, all of us need to do that work, number one. Number two, we need to know this land that we're living and working and playing on, and what are the stories. And I think we're doing a great job of that. We're helping our community learn, because our kids can be, hopefully you've heard, people will stop me in the grocery store and say, oh, my son just told me the story of Mount Brevoux. And so, it's through our kids, but our communities learning. And then building relationships, and we've already talked about. But then the final step is do something. We need to do something. We need to take that first step and know that we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. I think another thing that the board can be proud of is the blanketing work that has gone on. Last year, that blanketing exercise that happened out here was hard, it was painful. And that is the work of reconciliation. I'm really proud to say I'm from this district when this topic of reconciliation comes up, because we're doing that hard work. We're not just putting up artwork and using different materials. We're doing the hard work of engaging in real relationships with our community. The blanketing exercise that happened this year is such a beautiful example of how we did that first step, and it wasn't perfect. There were lots of mistakes, but now look at how far it's come. It was so powerful what happened in the gym there. And the nation stood there right beside us, and the chief and council and the councillors, the city councillors, and the municipality, all the leaders were standing together. That's pretty powerful, and that's what reconciliation looks like. It's hard stuff. Okay, sorry. So I guess my final bit is, I think that hopefully you feel proud of the work that you are doing and that our staff are doing, and know that we're well in our way. We're in the canoe and we're paddling. And folks, people in BC are watching what we're doing. And recently I heard people talking about the Elders Poetry Project, for instance, and their district claimed it, and they owned it, and they were celebrating it, or how it brought people together. And in the back of my mind, I was like, yeah, it started with us. People all over the province now have got wind of this. This is another locally developed and produced item, and the other thing that I want you to know is we share everything in the spirit of our Indigenous families. This doesn't belong to us. If people want to print it and use it in their school districts, they can. We do suggest, and it says right in here, that they have a Métis person, because this would be lovely to hand out and just, to a preschool kid and just let them play with it, but it's meant to be a teaching tool. The same with this, people are looking at how did you do that, and that's a really important piece. So it's a flip book this is a Hull Camino story. This story started in Hull Camino, and then we translated into English, which is really beautiful. You'll remember the Robert Munch books, which started in English and we moved to Hull Camino. But this is a really beautiful example of really moving into that Indigenous way of doing things. And the ministry on Friday just sent us a $10,000 grant to do some more language resource development. So they are also watching what we're doing here and looking for us to be leaders in this challenging work. Okay, go. Questions?
You started off with a story of 60 or 70 more classes without additional human resources to do this work. So what did that look like this? What is it looking right now versus last year?
Well, my staff just keep frowning at me. A couple of things have happened. So they're spread really thin, so their timetable is really tight, and we've tweaked it a little bit, but we've squeezed every bit of time out of them that we can. But the other thing that's happened is we have no casuals, and so for instance, Stuart is a part of Chief and Council, and when he's away, there's no one to fill in, so those classes just lose that opportunity. It's something I'm really struggling with. I don't know what to do next about that part.
And again, part of that comes, right, if you recall, in several areas this has happened, but because there's not a lot more kids, they're just in more smaller containers, the funding stays the same. It's not that we're getting 70 classrooms worth of kids additional funding, the funding stays the same. It's just so it's actually been a kind of an opportunity for schools to talk about how they organize and structure for these kinds of conversations. But it's a struggle nonetheless. And because relationships are so important, meeting with the ed staff, they're struggling to continue to keep those relationships up. They're not seeing some of the kids as much as they would have in the past years.
I'm worried, like Corrine today, she's going to work, she wants to go to work sick tomorrow. I'm trying to get her to stay home, but she knows that if she doesn't go, those kids don't get that lesson. So.
So when you talked about the $131,
Yeah.
You wanted to start doing things differently.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like in your head?
Well, one of the things that we're looking at right now, for instance, is we made a conscious choice we have limited resources to focus in on elementary. And so we're starting to withdraw from that. So I had 2 teachers working with the elementary itinerant team, and now Sally's working with the high school Hull Camino team to start developing that language piece. So we're redirecting some of it, and Rosanna is focused mostly, almost exclusively actually, on the high school as well. So you have some list of some of the things that we're doing in ABED, and also continuing to try to give teachers the tools and knowledge that they need so that they feel confident in bringing this stuff into the schools. It's the pedagogy piece is the Pro-D piece is a really important piece, right? Because it's people are afraid, and it's challenging. There's lots of challenging stuff to learn about. So I don't have any nice tight answers at the moment, unless you have something more specific.
No, just curious.
One of the things you haven't mentioned is the community partnerships that have been built. And I think those have been so successful in helping the kind of initiatives that your department is moving forward.
Yeah, really, that's part of the reason I gave you a sticker is because to remind me to talk about partnerships.
Oh, okay.
Because this is a great example of the Hull Camino Treaty Group, Parks Canada, and the school district all work together to put some amazing resources for teachers. But I think you're right, Candace, those relationships with each of the nations have been really amazing and rewarding. One of the things we're talking about now is in 2008, I think it was 2008, 4 goals were established, and now we're looking at those goals. Are they still the right goals? And so, but the relationships are so good. I have a little challenge that's coming out of it, and that's there's so much trust, but they're not showing up to all the meetings. Like we needed to brainstorm some questions this week. And they're like, oh, Denise, you just do it. I'm like, oh, people. Which is it's lovely. It's a lovely sign of us, but it's also a little bit of a challenge to keep everybody engaged.
I think the conversation that Trustee DeGroot and Spilsbury were at in Malahat around talking about the LEA and not just the LEA but the working group and how that's driven relationships. I think it's a good example of that.
Yeah, it is.
Community. Mention that.
Yeah, you said it. I don't know.
A growth.
I'd like
Please.
to- One of the things that was really interesting is that it wasn't moving fast enough, right? They were getting frustrated, and the comment was, Denise would tell us to just be patient. And I thought, yes, because you can't make people change. They have to change. They have to see the reason for it,
Yeah.
and it sometimes is, as they said, one house at a time.
Yeah.
And that was a really wonderful morning. I loved that. It was because it was so positive, and also because they said such nice things about you. And it was really nice to see you get that recognition for being that leader in it. That was great.
It does really feel like it feels like that with all the nations. Recently, Chris from Lyaxon is fairly new, and the first meeting she came to, she was just ripping a strip off me. Asking hard questions because she hadn't been part of the conversation, right? What about those grad rates, and what about kids on evergreens, and drilling down. And I hardly had to speak because Sarah and Shauna, like the other folks around the table, said, "Oh yeah, let us tell you about that. You know, the principals know who every single grad is. Actually, they can tell you which ones are on evergreen." And so it's taken time for us to get to that place. It was for great people to work with.
Speaking of evergreen, or
Grad rates.
do you want to
So if
tell
you
us about our
look,
findings?
let's talk about grad rates, because I had to have a little cry. Katie got to witness me step outside and have a little time, give myself a timeout. Because this year, our grad rate has been reported to have dropped from 61% down to 49%. That's our 6-year completion. And so there's the fact that that's disappointing. I'd like to see the numbers keep going up, but there's also the fact that that's many of my family members who were in grade 8 and did not make it to graduation. So so that hits home pretty personally. So immediately we started digging into that data and finding out who are those kids and how come they didn't graduate. And I think if I did the math correctly, 12 kids would cause that change. I might not have done the math correctly. My math isn't terribly good, but let's just go with 12. And Sandra has been working with me to figure out, and 9 of those kids already we have identified are discrepancies in data. So for instance, we have a student who's on a Dogwood grad program, and he has been changed to an adult grad program, which is fewer credits required, but that information hasn't been sent to the ministry. The ministry just sees that he didn't finish all of the courses and he counts as a non-grad. So we have a few students like that, a few students who should have been or were in the school records or on an evergreen program, but not, that information wasn't the same at the ministry level. So we also have a call on Friday with one of the folks, the data folks from the ministries, who will help us dig in even further and make sure we really understand. I anticipated a little bit of a drop, but not that kind of a drop. So it makes me feel better that it's not.
Do we know if the prior years were accounted for consistently with the criteria for this year?
Sorry?
In other words, you talked about some students moving from a regular grad program to an adult grad program and not being included in the 49%. Would they have been included in the previous years?
In the 61%? Or
yeah,
like was the same kind of,
are they comparing the same basis?
Yeah, maybe, I don't know.
Or has the criteria for which they're calculating the grad rate potentially changed over time as well?
We have more questions than answers at this point. So not to worry, and see the red line still goes up. It's a good thing.
Last question, trustee Salisbury.
Can I just ask, what numbers of kids then, if there are only 12 that can do that? Kind of discrepancy that.
What was the size of the
Yeah,
cohort?
just out of
I think it was
curiosity.
like 123.
Oh, okay.
Is that right?
Significant.
things close to
So 10% of that would be 12.
Oh.
Just saying.
Well done.
I'm not even the ST, but I'm kind of thinking.
Denise, thank you
Well,
so much.
hopefully that's helpful.
very
I
helpful.
would love questions if you have them. And if they feel like they're not politically correct questions, you can just slip them to me quietly in an email or, leave a note with Donna. Because I am curious about how you're feeling about things and if you have some wishes or dreams or ideas that you would like me to know or.
Thank you for your wonderful work.
Yeah, thanks Denise and team that, like Len, the team that sits behind is huge. And I think one of the conversations that this board is nudging up to is really the reconciliation conversation. What is the role of the trustee, the board in the reconciliation work? And I think Denise pointed to a couple of things already. One was many of you went outside last year and witnessed the blanketing ceremony.
Yes.
And not as many of you got the gift of seeing the next iteration, which was at Cow High last week, no, before Christmas. That was so different. It was unbelievable. And the trust that our First Nations partners are putting in us, and so when we saw the video issue that came out before Christmas, it was instant. We're in this together. Link arms, and that's an indicator of the years of work and trust and community building that's happened here. And so I think that's hard to quantify. That's hard to wrap into a nice, neat story or a soundbite, but that's the hard work. So thanks, Denise, for bringing that to our attention. And again, yeah. Facts and figures on the fun fact sheet.
Okay, moving on to Soji. Who's speaking to that?
I can give an update on
Sure.
as to where we're at. So I won't necessarily speak to the briefing note, because that just kind of gives you a background information. But what I will talk to you about is where we are at in the district. So we're new in the the SOGI world. We now are part of the provincial SOGI network. They started off with about, I think, 9 districts last year, and there's 49 districts that are a part of it this year. We meet regionally as a South Island group, and then we also meet as a whole island group as well as a provincial group a number of times a year. But certainly on the island, Victoria and Nanaimo are slightly ahead of us and are absolutely wonderful mentors and support us along the way. We had what we would call gay-straight alliances in most of our secondary schools. We're now calling them, gender, sexual identity as opposed to gay-straight alliances. I can't remember the exact wording, but we have, I think each of our secondary schools have that now as well, whereas it was just our larger schools before. We also had a lot of conversation around bathrooms, gender-neutral bathrooms and signage for those bathrooms. So our secondary schools went through quite a time in terms of designing what should that signage be. And so each of the secondary schools have kind of come up with their own logo for the gender-neutral washrooms. In the rest of the district, we will probably follow suit with the sort of where the direction of our other districts are going, and just make it very clean. Just washroom with a picture of a toilet, like so that there's none of this crazy arrows and all the rest of it. So just keep it really, really simple. It's a washroom. If you need to go, right? And some people are saying that this washroom's for everyone, but we will probably just go with something very simple. We didn't have SOGI leads in all of our schools. We now have a SOGI champion in each of our elementary schools. Iva and Sherry have I sort of asked them to sort of compile a group of library books, some resources that are sort of elementary level and resources that are secondary level. They've done a fabulous job of compiling, so and have now just finished processing most of the books. There's a couple of books on backorder, and then we just heard about an absolutely fabulous Indigenous book where a little girl comes out to her friend, and then the little girl sort of asks the mom, "What does this mean?" So the mom talked to the little girl about what two-spirited means. So it's a beautiful book. So that will be purchased and added to the list of resources. So each of our elementary schools are just receiving now a book of library books that are sort of geared towards elementary. They're both picture books as well as teacher resource books, and then the same for secondary. So we've got that going. We will be having towards the in a couple of weeks, we'll sort of have a 1-hour session with our SOGI champions, our SOGI leads at each of the school, just to kind of briefly review our policy and just to kind of let them, so what have I got myself into anyway, sort of thing. So sort of going over that with them. And then on the 28th of February, we're joining Sauk Saanich and Gulf Islands for some training. So all of our leads from each of our schools will be going and joining other districts in getting that same training, so that they're better prepared and can be supporting what's going on in the school, and then help us to be sort of advisory. So what is it that we need to be thinking about as we move down this road? So we're very much at the very beginning stages, but also very much from the viewpoint, it's about inclusion. How do we, it's not about curriculum, we're not teaching anything, we're supporting all of our students to understand that it's okay, they belong, and we need to embrace everyone's diversity and differences, and make sure that there's space for them to be happy in each one of our schools. So it's a little bit of a learning journey, and so that's kind of where we're at right now with SOGI.
So why only 49 districts? Why not everybody at this
It was put out, and I'm not sure the answer to that. I'm assuming that more and more will be. It might just be people's plates are full. It's just one more thing to add to our plates, perhaps. Yeah.
I think it came out at DSAC. For life, I can't remember where. I was with a group of students, so I guess it had to have been at DSAC. But we were talking about clubs and stuff, and somebody asked about, are there clubs? Was that DSAC? Okay, good. Was there a club that was supported within the school for kids that they could be with like-minded individuals and not feel threatened and feel very comfortable in their environment? So do we support that in our club structures in our schools now?
Well, I think part of that would be coming out of what was called, I can't remember the change name, but out of the Gay Straight Alliance. And as I said before, our two bigger secondary schools had that, and so they might have been students from some of our smaller secondary schools that hadn't quite established that. But absolutely, that would be part of what we would be doing for sure.
And part of what our SOGI champions will be doing as a network, the community resources and access and making them known and sharing it, and where can I go to?
Any other questions on this first? Thank you, Cheryl.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Much appreciated. Business and operations, Mr. Sanquist, you're being pretty patient tonight.
Beat the Spheros.
Oh, actually, it's, you know what, I can tie those in. It's great following, to be actually following two really strong educational presentations, because those are both programs that are supported by the allocations that the board makes through their budget model. Like the funds that you allocate to technology, we got to see a real live example of how those work, and the funds allocated to Aboriginal education, we had Denise talk about those, and they're all the different programs that the board supports are inclusive and included in the amended annual budget that we have here tonight. So we've been tracking the budget with the board over the last few months. Really, we start that around October, and at the last board meeting, we had an update on the budget, and the board made a recommendation that we include a few other items, and I'll go through those as we go through the reconciliation here. So really hard to see what we have on the screen, so we did print it out onto an 11 by 17, which we realize is also quite small, but felt that we needed all these columns to really communicate to you what's happened since May when you adopted your original budget for this year. And you just got it up there reasonably for the audience. So the first thing that we have here, we have a column which reconciles with a balanced budget, which was the budget that was adopted in May. I'm going to kind of just walk through each of these columns as we go across. So the 16-17 surplus, at the end of the year, we had monies that were restricted in the financial statements. That was almost $1.4 million. So that was brought into this year's budget. That was the rollovers for items like unspent learning resources, school supplies, the $50 per student grant, et cetera, et cetera. So those figures were presented during the financial statement projection. We talked at the last board meeting about how we received additional funding of $994,000, and that was for enrollment growth. So the September count had come in higher than anticipated last year, and that has now been brought into the budget. We talked about how we received additional funding of almost $104,000 for CUPE and USW benefits. So the board budgeted for those increased costs, not knowing that they would be funded. At the time that they we had our funding information last May, we didn't know that there would be additional funding coming for those from the province. So we get to bring that funding in to offset those. Then we just kind of pile a whole bunch of stuff together here in miscellaneous revenue adjustment of the most significant under tuition of $103,000. The board is supporting a cohort of education assistants training program through VIU. We're paying for the entire cohort, so they're paying us back for the students that are coming in that aren't ours, and that's $102,000 that you're seeing coming in under tuition. So some other ups and downs there that are quite minor. Now we move to a net savings. If you go right to the very bottom of that line of a net savings of $632,852. We added about 5 FTE teachers just due to the enrollment growth that weren't part of the Classroom Enhancement Fund. But we also saved about about $1 million in our average teacher salary that we've talked about before. So the net is the savings of about $632,000 on our teachers this year. New teacher development, that was a new line that we added after the last board meeting. So superintendent talked about the need to provide opportunities for our new teachers, because we have all these new hires who potentially haven't even had a lot of time as a TTOC, and they're currently teaching, and is there a way to support them? So there was $60,000 was brought in there. The worst flu season in 9 years, as has been reported, necessitated the need to look at our absenteeism replacement, particularly in the area of teachers, and put away some extra funding there in the budget, which we may or may not need next year, but certainly this year is a peak flu season. We're seeing it every single day on the dispatch reports that it's not slowing down, and not expected to. February and January are usually our big months, but we had flus earlier in the year and more severe earlier in the year than usual. So that was a new item that was added after the last board meeting. Additional VP additions. So after the last budget was adopted, additional VP was added to Maple Bay that needed to be put into the budget. As well as we left a contingency in there should the VP and exempt group be allowed to move within their bands. So currently staff have been allowed to be brought up to step 0. So a principal can be paid at, or I guess in the principal's case, there's an A, B, and a C. They're being permitted by BC, PC, and PSEC to be compensated at an A. If the opportunity comes available for it to become a B, there's some contingency to allow the board to make a decision around that without touching the surplus. If it doesn't happen before the end of the year, those funds go back into surplus. Education assistance, new FTE. So that figure of $727,000 was closer to 1.2 million, or it is actually 1.2 million, but we were able to make an argument with the ministry that about 10 FTE of those education assistants would be supported due to the complexities of implementing the classroom composition language. So I think the challenge that Denise talked about students being spread out more, Same thing is happening with the students with designations, where before you could put two students with the same designation could potentially be in the same class and share a service. Now, under the class size composition, they needed to be split, creating an additional need for additional service. So we were fortunate to have that supported. So the actual net cost of additional education assistance is now about $727,000 pressure on the operating budget. Just under miscellaneous staffing adjustments, the first one, 73,176 that you see there, at the top of that line, that was some additional clerical that had to go in to support additional classrooms at Discovery, and was split between Discovery and Bonner for our position, and the bus route. So the decision was made to run a school bus between the two campuses here, and that happened after the budget was adopted, so we've included that in here. Other professionals, 49,747, and that brings in part of the communications position that wasn't fully into the last year's budget, as well as recognize some small wage increases that were permitted in July. And then the substitutes for a minor amount, so that sort of goes through the staffing adjustments. Under dual credit tuition, we've increased that by $230,000, and one of the reasons we did that is because there's a big piece of revenue coming in under that funded enrollment growth, that $993,000 way over on the that we talked about earlier, which means that we're recognizing revenue for students that we're going to have to pay tuition for. Because a dual credit student generally generates approximately about a 30% margin. So if we're bringing in the revenue, we need to bring in the expense. And that's what that figure is, just to recognize the growth that's happening over what we had estimated. Demographics and policy consultant. So we brought in two consultants this year, one to help with the development of the policy manual, the other to support the demographics report. Now, we had money in the budget already for some of the demographics reports, so that's not the total bill, but that's what we had to increase the budget by to bring in those two individuals, which is $62,000. Communications, we set up a position, but we didn't provide any funding for the position to do things with, so we've done that here by allowing for the travel and professional development for the new position, as well as some of the advertising and web development that's happening. Moving across here, the busing contract, that is a contract out with Cowichan Tribes that was updated last year. And we were a little late on what we had allocated to cover that, and looking at the real costs as they're coming in, we needed to make an adjustment to make sure that the budget reflected the actual costs of that. Technology student learning devices, that was another decision made at the last board meeting to include an additional $50,000. Glenn talked about 2,400 student devices, I believe, in his presentation, of which 1,200 have just been replaced, which has put a fair bit of pressure on the budget this year as well. The wireless network is being upgraded this year as well, so we got pretty tight on what's left there, and so that amount was added in the event that we run out. Really by the end of the year. The other item we talked about was putting in a bus hoist over in the garage. That money would come out of operating. It could come out of capital. Reason we're suggesting it come out of operating budget as a transfer to capital is the capital is not an endless pot of money. It needs to be replenished only when you sell a building. That's what replenishes the local capital fund. And with what's happening with the capacity pressures, that's not going to be replenished in any significant way anytime soon. So we were concerned about taking 10% of the local capital fund for the bus hoist. If the operating budget could support it through surplus funds this year, that was a one-time expense. So it doesn't become part of a structural budget item where every year there's $100,000 for a bus hoist, one-time item. And it's been combined with $26,000, which was what it cost the board to support some handicap lifts into the back of some new school buses. So the province provided the funding for the bus, but they didn't provide the full funding for the lifts that wanted to go into the large buses, so that students or field trips that needed a bus that had a lift in it didn't have to take a second small bus along with the big bus. They can take the whole class in one school bus. Nice. And the other item here we have is we've increased, I think, we kind of went through this, didn't have wasn't through board motion, but we've increased the payment back to $50,000 for the repayment of the unfunded employee future benefits. That reduces the liability at the end of this year to $117,000. So getting very close to now understand that the board has been paying that since 2002, and that figure started at close to $4 million. So we reinstated that, so we believe that it was taken out just in the event that it could be returned, that it would be returned. And then the final column is just, there's always ins and outs. The budget is very, very dynamic. You see there's $24,000 worth of sort of ups and downs that bring us to the balanced operating budget of $80,745,213. So one of the things that you also have another sheet on is to show you what remains on the budget as far as your surplus. So which Gina can bring up, and this one would be large enough to see, I think, on the screen. So at the year end, there was $4,019,597 remaining in the. It was actually in surplus at the end of last year. Now to balance this year's budget, 2.7 of that was brought in, which means that the surplus remaining is $1,284,529. So those funds have not been brought into the budget. That's the board's surplus. That has grown by $30,428 over what was unrestricted at the end of last year. So you're very close to being in the same position you were at June 30th as far as the surplus. You haven't accessed it to balance this year's budget so far. And you would anticipate that there's always potential for that to go up when we finally hit year end as well. So that's what I wanted to explain about that $30,428, because you'll see that as a line item under surplus under your miscellaneous revenue column, fourth one over on your big sheet of 1117. Surplus appropriation, negative 3428. Returns that back to your surplus. So those are the details, kind of a high-level details on the operating budget. Certainly in the special purpose funds, one of the most significant changes was finally getting final figures on the Classroom Enhancement Fund, which is now close to $8 million when you combine the overhead component with the teaching component. That's inclusive of remedies, overhead, and actual classroom staffing. So I don't know how much detail you would like to go through in this document. Last night we sent you out kind of an overview of it to if somebody had an opportunity to read that, you could have a bit of an understanding of what the schedules mean. I think if Gina can bring up the actual budget. And just go to statement 2, which I think is the first statement. Yeah, that one. A little bit smaller. That's okay. So this is a consolidated, consolidated budget, and that's perfect. So you can see that there's some significant changes in enrollment of almost 200 students from the 2017 amended annual to the current amended annual. And so those students generated that additional money that we showed you with the $993,000. Big changes between the ministry grant of $70 million last year and $80 million this year. And the big reason for that is the Classroom Enhancement Fund, as well as the enrollment growth, so those two things combined. Tuition, talked about the $102,000 being charged to the VIU students that aren't ours, and a little bit of growth there in the international program. Other revenue remains pretty consistent. The big piece there is the local education agreement. It comes in under other revenue, which is about $4.7 million right now. Those are funds that flow through the First Nations partners and through to the school district. We dropped rentals and leases a little bit. We're getting more and more close to capacity in our schools, which reduces the opportunity to have some of those rental agreements in place. But we were able to offset that through investment income. This year, Karen worked to move some more funding over into the Ministry of Finance account, which pays us a little bit more than our bank. So the ministry borrows money from the school district to then fund. They're borrowing back the money that they gave us, so they don't have to borrow it themselves. And they give us a better rate than we can get in the bank. So we've been watching those balances and put a little bit more aside. Amortization of capital revenue, what that means is if the ministry gives us money to buy something, and we'll just say it's a piece of equipment, and that piece of equipment has a 10-year useful life, For every year for 10 years, we bring in 1/10 of what they gave us into revenue. Is a simple way to explain that. You'd expect to see our instruction expenses to go up if our revenue went up on the provincial side. Big thing there again is the classroom enhancement fund. You know, that $8 million coming in to support those additional classrooms this year. District admin is pretty close. We added communications into that and a couple of consultants to work on the policy and to work on the demographics report, as well as some there's some small wage increases in July to exempt staff and to CUPE staff that are included in there. Operations and maintenance, additional custodial time for the additional classrooms, and a few other maintenance-related items. Again, wages are a big portion of that, and there were some increases that came through the previously negotiated collective agreement. Transportation and housing remains really close. Again, just those are just inflationary pressures. So, big change in the budget between last year and this year is also around the budgeted surplus. So we've used more surplus this year to balance than we did last year. And reduce the unfunded employee future benefits at the same rate. And don't be alarmed by budgeted surplus deficit for the year. That comes out of the capital account and is a result of the ministry providing funding for all the site work, for all the portables that had to be moved, and it appears as a surplus because the expenditures don't show up against it in the budget. But it's not really a surplus that contributes to the bottom line of the school district. It's a capital fund surplus. So if we scroll a little bit further up, this is where the next one, that's perfect. This shows us the comparative columns of a consolidated budget. So we've just walked through $80 million, 531, 342 plus 144, 124 on this big sheet. So if you were to add those two figures together, they should equal to what's here, or close to what's here. $50,000 for the unfunded employee future benefits. And then under special purpose funds, there's a big change from $4.7 million last year to $11.5 million this year, mainly the classroom enhancement fund. Special purpose fund tangible capital assets purchased, those are assets purchased through the annual facilities grant. And then the capital fund total expense amortization of assets, pretty close. So we would see a significant increase of $12 million, almost $12 million, well, $11.3 million over last year, and a budget bylaw amount of $97,093,436. So I'm happy to answer any questions on the budget if there are any, and otherwise there is a recommendation for the budget included in the agenda.
Trustee Smith.
I'd like to move the recommendation of the Board of Education and Business Committee recommends to the Board of Education School District 79 Cowichan Valley adopt the 2017-18 amended annual budget in the amount of $97,093,436.
Is there a second? Trustee Croft, any discussion on that? I just want to thank for the guided tour. That's excellent document. Helps us all. Did it take very long to produce that?
It's easy when you know
Gina
what you're doing.
No discussion? Calling the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Just Sanquist, anything else at this time?
We do. We have one more item. It's not for decision, more for information. It's on the 2018-2019 annual budget development timelines. So we have put together a schedule close to last year's. There is a new item. What we did here is we put down on February 27th, we will start with bringing 2018-2019 budget assumptions. So one of the things we heard through our policy work is that it would be good practice for the board to give some direction to staff around things to consider as they start to build the budget, which would be wage increases that are in collective agreements. We have an election next year that's not in this year's budget that needs to be into next year's budget, just things like that. So we'll bring some information to the board earlier. And the other changes that we made here were to stick with last year with a single day for the trustees to meet with the partner groups, so the liaison meetings on April 5th. So not last year, I believe that's the way we did it, and it seemed to work quite well for trustees and the partners versus the morning spread out across the week. And we've adjusted the timelines somewhat around the BC School Trustees Association event, which falls towards the end of April. So really the budget will be substantially complete before that occurs, because we'll have had first and second reading of the budget on April 25th. So the timing of the BC SDA AGM is actually really good with the budget, where last year it kind of fell in the middle and delayed everything, kind of put the brakes on for a week.
Yeah.
Falls really, really well. So the goal being to have a balanced budget adopted at May 1st, which is the earliest we can really do it in May, and then from there be able to start the staffing that's initiated from that budget. So if there aren't any other suggestions, the board chair and I went over this, but if anybody else has ideas or any of those dates that they think should change, you could let us know.
It's good, and you don't need endorsement?
I don't think so, unless you think it should.
Thank you. Anything on policies? Motion to adjourn. Trustee Scott, all those in favor? Thank you very much, staff. That was rather informative.